Bienvenidos a Disrupt Everything, podcast series by Isra García. Reinvéntate a ti mismo y cambia lo que más te importa.
You go crazy. I'll follow along.
Okay. Hi, everyone. As you guessed, this time is in English, so it means we have an international guest. All I can say about the next guest here in Disrupt Everything podcast is that he's one of a kind. Someone who knows how to turn a man into a Superman, turn mediocrity into excellence, and turn an ordinary life to an extraordinary one. If we can now access to a hidden potential and jump into flow or mystical states that make us feel more alive, more fulfilled, and free, be sure that this man has paved the way before. I'm talking about Steven Kotler. Welcome to Disrupt Everything podcast series.
It's good to be with you.
Steve, thank you for Steven. Thank you for being in the podcast.
My pleasure.
Disrupt Everything. Explora los márgenes o muere intentándolo.
Steven Kotler is one of the world leaders in neuroscience, guerrilla neuroscience, as he likes to say. He's a high-performance entrepreneur and a writer that has appeared in every great medium you can imagine. Wall Street Journal, New York Times, CNN, National Geographic, Forbes, Wired, Time. He has been nominated for a Pulitzer Prize with 2 books, A Small Furry Prayer and The Provocative Stealing Fire with Jamie Will. This is a book on how to understand maximum human performance. In addition, he has written The Rise of Superman. Just give me a second. I have a dog barking there. He has written The Rise of Superman, a book through which I met his work in 2015, if I remember correctly. However, the list doesn't end here. Bold, Abundance, Last Tango in Cyberspace, Tomorrowland, and now the future is faster than you think. Written this time again together with Peter Diamandis. Steven has studied for over a decade with athletes, Navy SEALs, and entrepreneurs of the stature of Elon Musk, and others capable of doing things that we believe are incredible. Working to extract the formula to apply to anyone. He has studied in the University of Wisconsin, Madison, MA, and Johns Hopkins. Co-founder of several projects like Equilibrium and Rancho de Chihuahua. He now presents his new project, the Flow Genome Collective, a research and training organization whose mission is to understand the science behind top performance to use when training individuals and organizations. If you go to his website, to the testimonial section on Steven Kotler's website, you will find people like Bill Clinton, Tony Robbins, Elon Musk, Arianna Huffington, Michael Dell, Pharrell Williams, or Richard Branson. I think this exemplifies the scope and impact of his work. The most fascinating thing is that today we have the opportunity to interview such an interesting, provocative, and disruptive person, Steven Kotler. And again, welcome and thank you for having that time for the interview, so we can go deep into a lot of themes that we think make you a disruptor and a person who has unlocked new paradigms.
Well, thank you. It was very nice of you to say. It's good to be with you.
Steven, my first question, to start from a point where we can recall the most prominent highlights of your lifetime, is if you were about to put your life into a timeline, what milestone will you highlight on a personal level?
I have no idea. I don't know. There are a lot of them. I really can't. When I think back on my life, I can't pick out any single moment and say, yeah, this defined me. I was shaped by a million different moments and a million different brilliant people. Luckily, I can't point to any one thing. I guess if I was going to point to one thing, all right, I can't point to anything, but I'm trained as a journalist, and especially when I was trained back in the 1990s, I'm a very kind of deep investigative journalist. And I think that level of curiosity and skepticism at the same time really ended up sort of shaping how I think about everything I think about.
And in your professional moments, which kind of situations or milestone will you call as a Eureka moments that has unlocked the person that you are today?
There were a couple. So as you sort of pointed out in your introduction, I've spent almost 20 some years at this point studying the state of consciousness known to researchers as flow, right? It's defined scientifically as an optimal state of consciousness where we feel our best and we perform our best. And for anybody who's not familiar, it's any of those moments of sort of rapt attention and total absorption. You get so focused on the task at hand that everything else sort of vanishes and disappears. Your sense of self, time will pass strangely, it'll speed up, and 5 hours will go by in like 5 seconds. Occasionally it'll slow down, and you'll get a freeze frame effect. Maybe anybody who's been in a car crash, and throughout, all aspects of performance, both mental and physical, go through the roof. So that's what I've spent most of my life studying. And the research, the kind of biggest seminal moment in my life was when my early mentor, who was a neuroscientist named Dr. Andrew Newberg, this was when he was at the University of Pennsylvania. He's since moved on, but then he was at the University of Pennsylvania, and he was doing brain imaging studies of Tibetan Buddhists and Franciscan nuns, trying to understand what was going on inside their brains in deep meditative trances. And he discovered something that seemed a lot like something that was showing up in my own research with flow. And this was very early days when we really hadn't started to apply the tools of neuroscience to flow. Flow had up to that point been something studied widely in psychology, but we really hadn't. We had some theories, but we hadn't done much neuroscience. And Andrew was one of the first people to visualize flow, or visualize these kind of weird states in Buddhist monks and Franciscan nuns. And I was interviewing athletes, and they were having very similar experiences. And so I called him, and we sort of figured out that the same thing he was looking at during meditation, I was seeing a very similar variation of during flow. And it was that was a sort of Eureka moment for me, because it was when I realized we could use the tools of neuroscience to decode flow. And that was a really big deal. If we could figure out where flow was coming from in the brain, we could get more of it. We might be able to control it a little better. Maybe it wouldn't have to be such a random experience, and we could start to really use this to amplify performance. So that was a big deal for me. There's a bunch of others, but that was a good one.
And when you've been studying 20 years for devoting yourself to the flow performance and peak performance, and then now you create a project which is called the Flow Genome Collective, right?
No, it's called the Flow Research Collective.
Flow Research Collective. Sorry, yeah, I apologize.
That's all right.
And so now it's about training people to get into flow. What have you discovered?
We are at the Flow Research Collective. We're mostly predominantly a research organization. So we have research partnerships with universities all over the world: Imperial College in London, USC and UCLA in California, Stanford in California, etc. And so we study flow. And then we study the neurobiology of flow. Our mission is to sort of decode the neuroscience of peak performance. And then we use that to train everybody from kind of, special forces, Navy SEALs, those sorts of people, professional athletes, X Games athletes, all the way to CEOs of companies like Google or Accenture and the general public. And we do this in person, we do it digitally, and we're kind of a giant extended network of people who are devoted to trying to use science to decode peak performance.
And what have you discovered training people? Because you've been working with athletes, Navy SEAL, but as I understand, we also apply to entrepreneurs, to people who wants to access this. And what have you discovered on the other part? I mean, not on the athletes, not on the people that goes into.
Yeah, so it doesn't actually matter. And it's a couple of things that are worth pointing out, just big picture, and we can get into the nitty gritty if you want. But at a big picture level, so early on in your introduction, you used the word performance hack. I don't believe there's anything, I've not discovered anything that is a hack, meaning a shortcut. What I have discovered, and I think this is foundational, is everything that we mean by peak performance is about getting your biology, especially your nervous system, to work for you rather than against you, right? If you can get your biology working for you, every human being has been optimized already by evolution for flow and peak performance. Flow is how the brain performs at its best. It's universal. Anyone listening to this can get into flow. This is extremely well accepted, widely established. So it's about figuring out where does the state come from, and then using that knowledge to get more of it. And we've actually, this is something that's fairly surprising, and this was sort of a milestone, another one of those milestone discoveries, because it contradicted really everything I believed and had been taught for at least the first 10, 12 years of flow research. So if you go back into the 90s and you go to people who were trying to train flow using the psychology, there weren't a ton of success stories. There were a couple where people really nailed it and got it. A couple of companies, couple professional sports teams, whatever. But as a general rule, we were lousy at it. And what started to change is we started to get the neuroscience, and that was mechanism. And so we started, using that to decode flow, where it's coming from, how to get more of it. And now we see, for example, our standard, the Flow Research Collective, our standard training, it's called 0 to Dangerous. It's a 8-week digital training, though you do go through it with a PhD psychologist or a PhD neuroscientist as your coach. So you are being coached along the way, and there's a lot of homework. But we are seeing on the back end, and we're measuring flow pre and post using the standard instruments, we're seeing like a 70% increase in flow. And that's incredible. That's huge. That's really amazing. But it's not that the Flow Research Collective is that extraordinary. It's that we're all built for this. And because we now have the neuroscience, we understand mechanism, we can, it's no longer switchy, it's no longer subjective. It doesn't work exactly like a machine, but it's much more predictable. And as a result, we get very, very good results. So one of the things that's very surprising to me is that peak performance and really high levels of flow in one's life are an absolute possibility for everyone. That's what I've learned. And if you want to put it in a slightly different way, when people ask me, what have you done over the course of your life? What is like at the center of your work? I always say that I've spent 30 years studying the impossible. Right? That's my interest. Those moments in history when something that we believed was totally impossible became possible. I want to know, why did it happen? I want to know this in business, in science, in art, in technology, in culture, in sport, right? Wherever. And flow's always at the center of it. We always see that. We also see a lot of disruptive technology as well. We tend to see, people leveraging both. But what I've learned sort of doing all this work, the commonality is that each of us, we are all capable of so much more than we know. That's what I've learned over and over. That's what applies to training normal people is even when you get to the top of the fields, people are not all that extraordinary. They're extraordinary, don't get me wrong, but they're really great at leveraging the biology.
And how to leverage your biology?
Well, there's some basics that we should talk about. Before we even talk about flow, there are 7 things that positive psychology, right, has identified over the past 30, 35 years as sort of foundational to peak performance. And they're not even foundational peak performance. They're basically practices that get most of us are pretty subpar in a lot of things. And there's a bunch of practices that they've figured out that will get you back from subpar back to normal. And then flow and peak performance is how do you go from normal up to Superman? So you got to sort of start with what I call the positive psychology basics. The first thing is what is technically known in psychology as a locus of control, and is more commonly, you hear it talked about, especially in entrepreneurial circles, as mindset. But so you hear about a growth mindset. That's really another way of talking about a locus of control. And a locus of control is very simply, do you believe you have control over your life, or do you believe that life happens to you? Right? If you don't believe that you have control over your life and that you can improve at the things that you do and that you can in some way impact your destiny, you actually can't. There's not very much anybody can do to help you. And it's a belief, it's a frame, it's a belief, right? Some people believe one way and other people can believe another, but beliefs are mutable and you sort of have to start there. If you think life happens to you, if you're a victim of your life, you got to get out of that victimhood, right, before you can even start this discussion. And it's really sort of foundational. If you basically nothing. If you don't have a growth mindset, there's not a whole lot you can do. There's some things you can do, and we'll talk about them, but there's not a ton. Like peak performance is going to be totally closed to you. Then there are the positive psychology basics. There's 3 things that sit on the physical side that sort of are about energy levels in the body. And then there's 3 things that sit on the mental side that deal with sort of the cognitive side of the balance. On the physical side, the literature is really clear. If you're interested in performing at your best, you need 7 to 8 hours of sleep a night. And there's not a whole lot of wiggle room on that. There are rare outsiders who can get slightly less sleep and function as normal, but as a general rule, we can't. And cognitive high performance goes down significantly. And we ultimately, when we operate at a sleep deficit, flow is a high energy state. So if you want to perform at your best, you have to have the energy to create that state of consciousness. If you're exhausted all the time, you can't do it. You're locked out. For similar reasons, hydration and nutrition matter. I'm not an expert in either, so I'm just, hydration, nutrition. Eat well, drink plenty of water. End of Stephen's knowledge, but pretty much. But we know what that means. And the final thing is, and this is social support. And social support is very important cognitively, but the brain, we are hardwired to kind of be tribal. We're hardwired to have a community. We feel safer at a really basic foundational level when there are more people around us to help us meet challenges and solve problems, right? So having social support really matters, right? Like Chris Peterson, who's a positive psychologist, says you can sum up 30 years of positive psychology in one phrase, which is other people matter. In other words, it's just so foundational. We're just built that way. We're hardwired that way evolutionarily. So you got to have some kind of social support network in place. Obviously, this is probably twice as critical right now during COVID, since we're physically distanced from one another, and but still getting social contact really important. So then there's the 3 cognitive side things, and what this research shows is if you sort of want to improve your mood and sort of lower anxiety levels and just get back to, it sort of goes without saying that all of us function at our best when we're sort of calm, non-reactive, capable of, responding creatively and with intelligence and empathy and heart to the situation, right? So to do that, you need a certain amount of emotional, mental stability. And the 3 things that work best for that, the research is really clear, is a daily gratitude practice, a daily mindfulness or respiration kind of focus practice and daily exercise. And the research shows, a gratitude practice will take about 5 minutes. Mindfulness, to get the cognitive calming benefits we're talking about, it's 11 to 20 minutes. And exercise is roughly 20 to 40 minutes. You want to exercise. Remember, this is not about physical stuff. This is about mental stuff. You want to exercise until it gets sort of quiet upstairs. There's a technical term for that, but that's what you're looking for. And, that usually shows up, depending on your fitness level, between 20 and 40 minutes. So those are the sort of 7 basics that you have to even get into the discussion.
And having this is related to also to what you are working. I've seen you in the website, in the Flow Research Collective, the state of peak performance. And it's so super interesting that you've been leading by example, because you've been exposing yourself to risk, to these kind of peak experiences. What's been your peak experiences so far that has taken you into a peak performance level?
Well, flow is it's sort of the same question. Every time I've been performing my best, whether this is me on stage writing my books, sitting at my computer, this is me skiing down a mountain, when I'm at my best, like everybody else on the planet, I'm in flow. So those have been my best experiences. And I think peak writing experiences are sort of the most magical for me, but my preference is peak skiing experiences. I'd much rather be in flow while skiing than anything else. It's my favorite experience on earth. But other than that, I'm not quite sure what you're asking.
No, just wanna know what exactly. What I was asking, what was that peak experiences that get you in this flow state?
Yeah, that also, I spent a lot of time in the backcountry with my dogs. My wife and I have a lot of dogs, and I spent a lot of time hiking with them through the backcountry. And there's, we run up and down the mountains, and that's a great group flow experience. Running with a pack of dogs is an amazing group flow experience. It's very, we've been running with wolves for 50,000 years as a species. So there's something very kind of foundationally flow about that experience. It's a very old one.
Stephen, you were saying about the importance of technology, and this is I guess is I was reading your last book, The Future Faster Than You Think, and the subtitle, the subheading, which is how converging technologies are transforming business, industries, and our lives. So, what changes are lying ahead, and which ones are going to have a more profound impact?
Oh God, those are tough questions. Now you're asking hard questions. So the book is really, the book is a third in a series that I've written 3 books with Peter Diamandis. And the first book was about sort of how individual technologies, whether this is artificial intelligence or robotics or nanotechnology or healthcare, or take your pick, we're beginning to accelerate along exponential growth curves. So the familiar example of this is Moore's Law, right? Moore's Law is an exponential growth curve is a doubling. So instead of linear growth is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Exponential growth is 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 8, 8 becomes 16, and so forth. And we see this in computing in Moore's Law, which says the number of integrated circuits in a transistor doubles every 18 months. So every year and a half, your computer gets twice as fast, but the cost stays the same. That's an exponential growth curve. And we're familiar with it in computing. So what Ray Kurzweil, who's the head of engineering at Google, and Peter's partner in Singularity University, where they study exponentially accelerated technologies, discovered is that once a technology becomes digital, meaning once you can program it into the ones and zeros of computer code, it hops on the back of Moore's Law and it starts accelerating exponentially. So Abundance and Bold, our first 2 books, the first book was, hey, we can harness exponential technology and start tackling grand global challenges. And we were looking at impossible challenges, energy shortages, healthcare shortages, water scarcity, poverty, those sorts of things, where, you know, exponential technology was giving us tremendous tools, and we were making enormous progress where we hadn't forever. So that was abundance. It was followed by bold, which was a sort of a how-to. Entrepreneurs read abundance and went, wow, this is really cool. We want to, you know, use this technology to start businesses that can both, you know, impact the world and for good, and, you know, help us make a lot of money. And so bold was sort of a playbook, right? That was when I spent a lot of time with Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson and Larry Page. You know, they were the focus of that book. Kind of entrepreneurs who had built impossible businesses in record time. And it looked at, you know, how did they do that? And how did they leverage these exponential technologies? And then faster is a new phenomenon. And this is what makes your second question so difficult, which is what's going to be reinvented. So faster is about, hey, these formerly independent lines of exponential technology, they're now crashing into one another, right? And you get crazy things when they start crashing into one another. The book opens with the flying car industry, which is here. The flying cars are here. We haven't seen them in our cities yet, but Uber wants to have flying car services up and running in Los Angeles and Dallas and Dubai by 2023, because these cars are autonomous. And because of COVID, we may see them even faster. But you get flying cars not because any one technology started to accelerate, but because artificial intelligence bashes into robotics, which bashes into material science, which bashes into new energy technologies and so forth. And when you get converging exponentials, you get a whole that is much greater than the sum of its parts. And I mean much greater. So Ray Kurzweil has pointed out that thanks to converging exponentials, we're going to experience over the course of the next century, roughly 20,000 years of technological change. So that's birth of agriculture to the Industrial Revolution twice in the next 80 years. It means over the next 10 years, we're going to experience roughly 100 years worth of technological change. So think back to what the world might have been like in 1920, right? We've just gotten the automobile kind of thing to where it is today, and do that by 2030. And that's what the book is about. And thus it looks at the 11 biggest industries in the world: entertainment, healthcare, finance, insurance, etc., and tracks what's going to happen and how they're going to be completely transformed over the next decade. And, you know, it's a good news, bad news story for entrepreneurs, for people who can get out in front of this stuff. We think Peter has been quoted repeatedly saying he thinks more wealth is going to be created in the next 100 years than has in the history of mankind. And he's probably not wrong about that. But simultaneously, for legacy organizations, as we're discovering right now in the world, you know, organizations that were built for the 20th century that are built on principles of like safety and security and scale, and, you know, success equals having giant infrastructure and numbers of employees and all that stuff. Wow, the next 10 years are going to be a crazy rocky ride. So that's what the book is about. And
I had the question. The link between bold, abundance, and the future, but you reply really accurate.
Yeah, there's another link that's worth talking about for a second, which is the link between all the technology books and all the peak performance books, because I think this is really important, especially because there are a lot of entrepreneurs who are listening, and so this is the link. It turns out, you know, obviously, if you can look at these exponential technologies, think exponentially, and understand what convergent means and where we're going, the opportunity is incredible. The problem is that the human brain evolved in an era where everything was local and linear. Local, like your entire world was a day's walk away. Linear, meaning the rate of change was really slow, right? There's like 10,000 years between the invention of fire and the invention of the wheel, and like 25,000 between the wheel and the boat. So like things moved really slowly. We live in a world that's global and exponential, and the human brain can't process information at this speed or this scale. In fact, worse, we can't actually even see, as you know from reading faster, right? We're blocked from projecting into the future. We have built-in sort of 10-year final time horizon, most of us can't even get that far, and it's a real problem. Flow is the only time the brain processes information at speed and at scale. So it's literally sort of a state of consciousness that's really built to help us interact with a global and exponential world. And so that to me is where these things come together so nicely, and one impacts the other.
It would mean that the flow is the tool that human beings can use for adapting the change of the speed of light, I would say.
Well, you got to think about what flow is, right? Flow evolved for us to handle peak performance, situations that demanded peak performance. So you got to think of it from an evolutionary perspective. Evolution is shaped by the threat of scarcity, right? So when we confront scarcity as humans, there's only two responses. There's only ever been two responses. You can either fight over resources, or you can get creative, cooperative, and innovate and make new resources. So flow, if you look at like, what does flow amplify in the brain? What skills do we know get amplified? Motivation, productivity, learning rates, creativity, innovation, and a whole bunch of strength, stamina, and grit shit. And if you break it out, it's basically everything that we need to respond to scarcity. So it's everything we need to fight or flee, or get creative, cooperative, and innovative, and make new resources. So that's what gets amplified. And the point is, when we need to make new resources, because something just happened, right? Like famine just showed up, or all our fruit trees dried up and we got to go find more. Crisis situations were really built to move fast in the face of crises using flow. That's sort of what it was designed for, and the modern world is sort of at that speed. So it's the built-in tool. Does that make sense?
It really does. It really does. And it sort of clarifies what we need to harness for the future and for the present too. And Steven, what do you mean, or can you elaborate on when you talk about the era of the extraordinary in the book, in Faster?
Oh yeah. So what we're talking about is that our current era is an era of extraordinary. We have more capabilities at our fingertips, and the world just witnessed this. Most people may not be looking at it, but I'll give you a great example. If you go back a decade ago, 12 years ago, 15 years ago, and you wanted to create a vaccine or a cure for a disease, it would take 10 to 15 years, and it would cost billions and billions of dollars. In January, the world had 0 COVID vaccines and 0 COVID cures. Today, and there are probably more, but this is just what I literally know of, there are 80 some drugs and or vaccines that are in some form of testing and trials. There are 3 drugs, vaccines that entered third stage human trials this week. Nothing like this has ever happened before at this speed. This is what happens when our intelligence, robotics, crowdsourcing, information technology, right? If this of 6 or 7 exponential, this is totally impossible. We're witnessing like what essentially are medical miracles over and over and over again, and we're not noticing them, but that's actually what's going on.
And this opens the door to also the power of convergence, which is another chapter in the book, right?
Yeah, it's flying cars, which we talked about earlier, is the great example, because these are sort of 100-year-old fantasy. There are literally patents in the U.S. Patent Office for what's called roadable aircraft, going back to like, I think, late 1800s or the early 1900s, right? They've never worked. None of them, a couple have flown, most have not, none of them can get at scale. Today, 100 different companies are making flying cars. Every major car company is making flying cars. Every major aerospace company is making flying cars. And on average, by the way, they're going to go 150 miles an hour, be able to cover 3 hours, be able to fly continuously for 3 hours with 4 to 5 passengers in them, depending on whether or not you have somebody in the driver's seat or the robots or not. This is like 100-year-old fantasy that sits at the power of convergence, and it is on field, right? And can talk about the sort of massive transformation that's going on, but pretty much every job on earth is being massively transformed. Really interesting ways.
And what do you mean then by I think this question, the last question, leads to this one, which is, so does this means the rebirth of everything? And what do you mean by that?
So this is sort of let's put it in a little bit of a bigger picture. I think what Peter and I have said sort of from the beginning, and we think this now more than ever, is that we now have the technological power to solve the world's grand challenges, whether we're talking change or pandemics, these sorts of things. We actually have the technology to start to solve things at a giant scale. We also believe it's going to require the largest cooperative effort in history, all of us working together. And I think, by the way, we just got a demonstration that we can do this, right, at a global level in a number of amazing ways. So that's totally possible. And I think that's the big point in all of things, is that if we want to work like never before and band together like never before, for the very first time in history, we can go after poverty, energy shortages, wealth inequality. I mean, like all this stuff that we have never been able to solve, we seem to be able to go after in a meaningful way. And that's really cool. That's the big point. But I should point out, by the way, largest cooperative effort in history doesn't just mean everybody sort of working together. It also means people in flow, working at their very best. That's the only way this gets done, I think.
And you're linking flow and also with what's the link between flow and risk? And is any link also with longevity?
Great questions. So do you mind if I back up a step before I answer and give you some context for the risk question?
Sure.
Which is, flow states have triggers. If you want more flow in your life, how do you do it? Well, there are triggers. Triggers are preconditions that lead to more flow, essentially, up the probability and the reliability of you experiencing the state of flow. And what they all share in common is flow follows focus. It's a state of complete concentration in the present moment. So drive attention into the present moment. They do it in 3 different ways, using 3 different bits of neurochemistry and biology and whatever. And I won't bother going into that right now. But that's what all the triggers do. One of the one piece of neurobiology that you need is, one of the ways they work is by driving a neurochemical called dopamine into our brain. Dopamine, we feel dopamine as excitement and enthusiasm and curiosity, and it's the desire to understand something, to make meaning out of the world, or to kind of solve challenges, right? When we go, and it's everything from like sexual lust, if you're in a bar and you see an attractive stranger and you cross the bar to talk to them, right? Like that, you'll feel dopamine. But it also shows up whenever we take a risk, encounter something novel, unpredictable, et cetera, et cetera. So there are a lot of flow triggers that drive dopamine. Risk is one of them. Novelty, complexity, unpredictability, and pattern recognition, which is the linking of ideas together. When we find connections between ideas, all these are ways of driving dopamine to our system. So any of them work. Risk tends to push a lot of dopamine into our system. Now, I don't just mean physical risk. Physical risk works. but so does emotional risk or social risks, right? Public speaking tends to really produce flow because it's a giant fear. So when we take the risk of public speaking, shows a lot of dopamine in our system, and very flowy experience for seasoned speakers. Anyway, so you could also take creative risks or intellectual risks. Those will also work. So we see flow, very high flow environments were like action sport towns, like Whistler, or in Europe, Chamonix, right? Where people are taking a lot of physical risks, very high flow towns, very high flow lifestyles. But it's also Silicon Valley, right? There's that fail forward, fail faster motto in Silicon Valley, which means that they've created companies where employees have the space to fail, right? There's a sign hanging at Facebook that says move fast, break things. And you can argue that maybe Facebook has broken a few too many things, but that's a topic for somebody else. For me, that's about risk taking and enabling a little bit more peak performance. So this could be intellectual risk, like Facebook, where they're saying, hey, take the business risk, take the intellectual risk, move fast. Or this could be athletics, action sport athletes in the mountains in Chamonix.
And is any link with this? Because I know you have really...
You said longevity. That was exactly the second question.
Yes.
So it's a great question. And excuse me. The short answer is we don't know. So when you talk about extending healthy human lifespan, on the physical side, we don't know if there's any link with flow. We do know that the neurochemicals that show up in flow boost the immune system and reset the nervous system, so they flush stress hormones out of your system. So we know that it's too much stress, right, definitely causes us to age. It's not good. So on that front, there might be some kind of prophylactic protection that way, but that hasn't been studied. But what is interesting is when they look on the other side of the coin, and you look at sort of like people who are high performing late in life, you tend to see a lot of people with very high flow lifestyles there. And we know there's one of the most well-established facts in psychology is that flow directly correlates with overall well-being and life satisfaction. Very, very much so. In fact, there's 3 definitions of happiness in positive psychology, sort of 3 levels of happiness that you can achieve on this planet. And the top 2 levels both include high flow lifestyles as part of what's necessary. So for the cognitive side of it, we have a little more data that says, hey, for people who are high performing, on into their older years, there seems to be a lot of flow involved in that equation, but that's about all we know so far. You would have to. So we at the Flow Research Collective, there's the research lab. We were working on a biophysically based flow detector, right? Something that's going to be able to look at certain kind of neurobiological and physiological signals and tell us, you are in flow. And we're not the only ones. There's a couple other labs who are working on this, and we collaborate with some of them. Also, we're sort of competing and cooperating at the same time. But we're all sort of going from this. Everybody's pretty convinced that we're, sometime in the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to have that device. Once we have that device, it will answering a question like yours will be better. And the other thing I will say is right now we're working with my new mentor, among other people, on a project trying to develop even a questionnaire, just a survey that will allow us to tease out a high flow lifestyle and get some longitudinal data along those lines. And we might be able to start asking questions. In fact, now that we've had this conversation, we will start asking questions about age. How old are you? How do you feel? How's your health level? How much flow do you access? How long? Right? Those kinds of questions. Because it's a great question, and nobody's taken a really hard look at it. Though I will say I am working on a book on peak performance over 50, because there's a lot of data showing that human peak performance, you actually don't really, cognitively, you can't start getting to the upper levels of peak performance until you're 50. So because the longevity stuff is moving so quickly and people in their 40s and 50s are now are able to maintain health and vitality in 60s, this is big news, right? So it's going to rewrite the rule book on a lot of what you would call wisdom. Neuroscientists have been trying to what is wisdom? What the hell do we mean by that?
Interesting question.
You're right. So the first guy to poke at it is a guy at NYU. He's originally Israeli, but he's now at NYU. He's named Elkahanan Goldberg. He wrote a book back in the late 1990s called The Wisdom Paradox. He got interested in a really weird question, like how was it possible for Ronald Reagan to govern the country while he had Alzheimer's, right? Which was a real, like in his second term, he had Alzheimer's and yet he could still govern America. And Elkanan asked the question, well, how is that even possible? And that's where he started down this road. And it led him to a foundational understanding that we've since built on of, this might be wisdom. And other work was done at Harvard and blah, blah, blah. We're starting to have some answers to those questions. And there are certain neurobiological changes that happen in normal adult development. They don't become possible until you're in your 50s. And what you gain with those changes is the ability to see things from multiple perspectives at once and a lot more empathy. And those things are foundational to peak performance, especially to innovation and creativity. So especially what we would mean by like peak performance, especially in like the business world in the 21st century, it's not really possible until you're in your 50s. And then it's only possible under certain conditions, and flow really is one of them. So it's neat. It's a whole new frontier. So you're asking a question that literally I think is on the cutting edge of the cutting edge right now. And I don't think we can answer it just yet, but I think we're 5 years away from starting to be able to get meaningful answers, which is really cool.
I hope I can have the chance to interview you from 5 years from now, so we can explore this question and others that would be more interesting too. You open the door to something that is wisdom, that it has to be with sometimes virtue, but like if you can explore from a neuroscientific point, I think it opens, as you said, a new paradigm, right? Steven, a side note, I'm doing now like a 40-day complete fasting. This is my day 35, and you were talking about the flow and the risk, and it's amazing when you don't have any food in your body for 35 days, how clear you see things, how clear you can act, how clear you can decide, everything. I mean, it's just and it's linked with the flow, right?
Well, there is zero data on fasting and flow. None. Now, there are tremendous amounts of sort of what scientists would call anecdotal evidence or history, right? Historical evidence that people have been using fasting as a way to transform consciousness for a very, very long time. I don't know what it does to consciousness, right? So I can't even speak. Is it flow? Does it prime you? None of that stuff. The only thing I know about fasting is that, it's pretty much one of the more well-established facts about health and longevity is low calorie diets, you'll live longer, right? Like that we know. What is the best diet for peak performance? We have no idea. Right? We really don't know. And there have been no really good efforts to figure it out. You would have to do, it would have to be a big data experiment. You'd have to, enroll hundreds of people, thousands of people, and have really good ways of measuring flow using a biophysical flow detector. Then we can start answering those questions. And the other thing that is really true, that I guarantee you, is just like if you're paying attention to what's going on the cutting edge of medicine, right? It's really clear that everybody's body is very individual, and that cutting edge medicine is N to 1, right? It should be entirely personalized based on everything from your psychology to your transcriptome, your connectome, your proteome, your genome, your microbiome, blah, 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 right? That's where medicine is heading. And on the peak performance side, there's a rule that we live by at the Flow Research Collective, which is personality doesn't scale. Biology scales. So what works for me is guaranteed almost not to work for you because of nature and nurture, because everybody's, so the 22 flow triggers that we know about, they're based on biology. Which ones are you most susceptible to? That's based on your personality, your history, your genetics, a lot of other stuff, your mood at the particular moment, right? So very, very individual. But you know, so in general, there's a lot more individualization there in terms of how you scale it across populations.
Thank you for the answer. But Steven, what have you discovered doing the research of your last book that has impacted most in your life? All that you've written in the future is faster than you think.
It has the most impact on my life?
Yes.
Wow. That's a really interesting question. I mean, so I can say that the advancements in sensing technology and artificial intelligence is what enables us to do our research at the Flow Research Collective, right? The advancement of brain imaging, artificial intelligence, and kind of biosensors is where we do our work. So on a personal, like on a research level, that's the thing that's kind of most impactful. As far as the other stuff goes, it's, it's still hard to I'm a low tech guy with a lot of stuff. Like, I still, like, people say, what's your favorite technology? And I'll usually tell you the name of my fat skis, right? And if they ask me for one more, I'll say, well, I'm really fond of Microsoft Word. And I kind of like my smartphone, but I don't, I really would be happy to give it up.
Okay. Thank you so much for the answer. What do you, from your experience, what would you say, like, will be briefly the traits of the Superman applied to the man or woman of today?
Oh, that's an interesting question. There's a specific answer, and I don't have the list in front of me. Let me see if I can find it for you while I talk to you. So there's a couple easy ways to answer this. When you look at what flow amplifies, right, it's predominantly motivation, creativity, and learning. And when I say motivation, so when scientists talk about motivation, they split it into 3 categories. There's drive, which is all your different intrinsic motivation, and this could be fear as a motivator, or this could be curiosity or passion, purpose. So there's intrinsic motivation, then there's goals, and then there's grit. So all 3 of those things are considered motivation. And then creativity is and learning. And what we see in peak performers is really exquisite. These are all the things that flow amplifies, but these are all the things that peak performers also work really hard to train up. They have phenomenal motivation skills, phenomenal creative problem solving skills, and phenomenal accelerated learning abilities, right? Those are the skills that are common there. And it's basically the thinking here is this. Let me answer this question in a different way. So what's the difference between an average person and, say, a US Navy SEAL when it comes to training them in flow and peak performance, right? That was a question you asked a little bit earlier. Let me answer it now. The difference is I can train both groups of people in flow, and both are going to be able to access a 70 to 80% increase in the amount of flow in their life. For the Navy SEAL, or for the most of like a Fortune 500 executive, somebody who's really at the top of their game, they're going to be able to sustain it, meaning I'm going to massively increase the amount of flow in their lives, and they're going to be able to continue at that accelerated rate over time and really get the benefits of it. Average person is going to get a huge blast of flow, have a whole shit ton more flow in their life. They're going to get way more done, and then they're going to hit a wall, and they're going to sort of return to baseline, and progress is going to really slow down. And it's when that happens, it's never, the problem isn't with flow. The problem is you've got a chink in your armor. You don't know how, you don't have all your intrinsic motivators in line. You haven't set proper goals for your life. You don't have the grit skills you need. You haven't learned how to learn. So you can't, like, flow requires us to be at the edge of our skills. To always be learning, and it accelerates that process, but you have to know how to learn, and you have to be driven to learn, to keep onboarding new skills, right? And then finally, you have to really work on creativity. This means making time in your life for creativity. This means learning how to think differently. This means learning how to expand creativity. Really, really, those are the skills. Because I always say that, like, in the high performance equation, motivation is what gets you into the game. Learning is what keeps you there. Creativity is how you steer, and flow is how you amplify the whole process. It's how you turbo boost the whole process. That's essentially always going to be the equation, because that's the biology. Those, when you talk about peak performance and what can we do on the mental side of peak performance, that's it. That's what we can do. Those are the things. That's our biology. That's what we're wired for. So it's always those things. So what the difference between normal people and everybody else is that they've got those skill sets locked in as well. And then when you, like, layer flow on top of it, there's no chinks in their armor. But for most of us, there are still chinks in our armor. And so those are, I don't know if I completely answered your question, but that's as close as I can get to it.
And Steven, what's then the difference between flow and a mystical state, and how to enter to a mystical state if it's not the same?
So there's a complicated question. So let's talk about I'm a science guy. So when I talk about mystical experiences, I'm just talking about the experiences we have, right? I don't know what they mean, right? That sort of stuff. But so there's a whole catalog of experiences that are essentially north of happiness: trance states, out of body experiences, near death experiences, speaking in tongue, all these things, right? Mm-hmm. Flow was classified as a mystical experience until the 1950s. Science and research into flow started in the 1870s, but they thought until the 1950s it was only experience reserved for really, really spiritual and religious people. And it was only in the 1950s that they found it in a giant group of atheists, and people went, oh, wait a minute, this is not a spiritual experience. But at the upper edge of the experience, you can't tell the difference between it, because when you're in a flow state, you can have out-of-body experiences, you can feel one with everything. All the classic ways of defining a mystical experience show up in flow. What has happened in the past 20 years, and my mentor, Dr. Andrew Newberg, was really the first guy to do this, and is still the world's expert on this. We have put everybody having every possible kind of mystical experience you could possibly imagine inside of really high-powered brain imaging equipment. And we have started to decode the biology of it. And so the differences are really subtle. There's a lot of overlap. The same parts of the brain tend to turn on and off. Usually when we move from flow into the more mystical experiences, you start to see activity in places in the brain like the temporal parietal junction and the temporal parietal lobe. and so if you have an out-of-body experience, you experience a trance state, or a deep, deep meditative state, or start to experience oneness with everything, right? Any of those things. And oneness with everything, like, this is when you're, surfing and you feel like you're one with the ocean, or you're skiing and you feel like you're one with the mountain, or you're painting and you feel like you're one with the canvas, or I'm writing and I can't sort of separate myself from the words, right? That's that experience. Those tend to be effects produced by the temporal parietal junction. They show up in flow, and the same sort of activity in that the parts of the brain produce it. But that's one of the differences. There are a couple others, but so there's a lot of overlap. The same changes in neural anatomy, neurochemistry, neuroelectricity, they're all roughly the same. We tend to see in some of the more quote unquote mystical experience, there seem to be more serotonin involved than in other experiences, but that's not always the case, but that does seem to be the case. But it's, so there's a lot of overlap, which is just to say the same parts of the brain are generating these experiences. I can really go into like a lot of nitty gritty detail, but if you're really curious, you could read Stealing Fire, because we take a look
here. So it was one of the questions I wanted to ask you about the Stealing Fire. It's just if you can just elaborate for a while on for a bit on the mystical fire, the ecstasy, and the way to Ulysses.
Well, Stealing Fire is a book about how there is massive similarity between mystical states, between a variety of altered states, and that altered states can be used for peak performance. And then the book looks at how the Navy SEALs, how organizations like Google, how festivals like Burning Man, how Silicon Valley executives, on and on and on, different groups of people have started to leverage altered states of consciousness to improve performance, right? Some of this is the fact that, like, some of this is really pedestrian. It's 50% of all companies in the United States now have mindfulness programs for their employees, right? Because mindfulness is a way to shift our consciousness and make us calmer and less reactive and better thinkers, and et cetera, et cetera. So some of it is really, simple. And some of it is, people microdosing with psychedelics. I'm not a huge fan of that, but there's a lot of it going on and people are getting amazing results. I'm not particularly interested in it, but other people really are, and we talk about that. So there's a whole, all we're saying in the book is, hey, wait a minute, these altered states of consciousness all seem to have peak performance benefits. Specifically, they amplify creativity, innovation, collaboration, cooperation, sometimes productivity and motivation. There's dangers, there's downsides, there's dark corners, but as a general rule, they can be utilized for peak cognitive performance, and a lot of people are doing it. That's sort of the point of the book. And you want to talk about the road to Eleusis. It's literally, I don't want to go into all the neurobiological changes that go on in the brain, but in the same way that we sort of use what's going on in the brain for flow to figure out how to get more of it, we can do that with all kinds of altered states. In fact, there are now VR, virtual reality applications developed by scientists in Switzerland. If you want to go have an out-of-body experience, you can go test out one of their technologies and have an out-of-body experience in virtual reality, right? There's the God helmet that was developed years ago by Michael Persinger that uses weak electromagnetic currents to stimulate the temporal parietal junction, the temporal parietal lobe, the two parts of the brain I was talking about a second ago. And people have all kinds of crazy experiences. They hear voices or see hallucinations, or they'll feel the presence of a ghost or a god, or what's known as a sense presence, or they'll have out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences, etc. So like we're getting to the point that like this stuff is becoming technology, which is crazy and interesting.
Wow. And what superpowers do you think we are missing or we are not willing to pursue due to the flow and the peak performance? What do you see in the
So I agree with the poet Maria Rilke, Rainer Maria Rilke, who really felt that the greatest human superpower was empathy. I still think that's the greatest human superpower. Empathy for all is sort of my stance, and that's all humans, plants, animals, ecosystems. I think that's really what it means, and I think empathy is our superpower. And certainly, what we know about wisdom and cognition and the human brain, and even flow and creativity, like empathy is our superpower. Rilke said it, and I think he was right.
And Steven, before the rapid fire questions and heading towards the end of the interview, the last question before that is what we need in our life or work toolkit in order to reach our peak performance and be the very best person we can be, because it's something that you've been putting all your life on doing it.
Well, so I can't train you up in flow in 7 minutes, but what you need is to learn sort of motivation. I laid it out: motivation, learning, creativity, flow. Go to the Flow Research Collective. Go www.flowresearchcollective.com/flow blockers. It's a free diagnostic. Anybody can take it. And it literally will help you look over your life and say, this is the thing that you're doing that's sort of standing in your way, right? And so that's free. If you want to take it the next step, go to zerotodangerous.com and you can sort of sign up for an interview with one of my trainers, and he'll get on the call with you and talk about your life for an hour and see how flow will make a difference and see if one of our courses is right for you. But there's a lot that's free information. There's tons of videos that are free. Just go avail yourself of the resources that are free for you and start there. And, if you want to go deeper, there's a ton of books on flow. I've written some, a lot of other people have written others. Go crazy.
Thank you. We go into the rapid fire questions. What's your most valuable skill?
My most what?
Valuable skill.
Probably my ability to find connections between far-flung sets of data.
And what about your weirdest habit? This weirdest habit you cannot get rid of?
Well, I don't know. I've gotten up every day for 35 years at 4 o'clock in the morning to start writing, and people think that's pretty weird.
Any secret ritual?
I don't think no. Do I have a secret ritual? No, I don't have a secret ritual. I do some weird things before I'm about to get off a chairlift and ski something pretty gnarly, but that's just to pry myself to get into flow, but it looks pretty funny. Does that count?
Yeah, it does. What about you have any personal hack that helped you during the day?
This is a long answer. I mean, like, my day is very peak performance is a schedule. There's a bunch of onboarding stuff you have to do, but from that point afterwards, it's basically a to-do list and a schedule. And the secret is just being able to do it every day. So that to me is sort of the answer.
Okay.
Like,
what's been your biggest failure?
Oh my God, there are so many. But they're all my superpowers. I mean, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
I don't know what my biggest failure has always become, my largest triumphs. I don't really know how to answer that question. I have a handful of regrets, but I don't know if I look at anything as a failure.
What's the success?
I mean, there's a lot of times I wish I would have been a better person.
Okay.
But,
What's the success you learn the most from?
I do not know. But my partnership with Peter Diamandis has probably taught me the most out of anything. So it's not one success, it's 3 books that we've written together, but that's taught me the most out of anything I've done.
Who would you like to work with?
Living or dead, or just living?
Living or dead.
William James is who I would like to work with. It's like the sort of the godfather of psychology, and would be the person I'd want to work with the most. I'd love to work. There's a bunch of neuroscientists. I would love to work with Robert Sapolsky at Stanford. I think is a brilliant mind who I haven't met, and I would, love to work with. There's a bunch of really great flow researchers in Europe at the Karolinska Institute who I've not gotten to partner with on anything yet. I'd love to work with those folks. Who else? As a general rule, if I want to work with somebody, I'm sort of working with them. There's probably a handful. I mean, there's others, but
yeah,
I don't know.
What's the book you have read the most?
Have read the most?
Yes.
Ooh, yeah, that's probably going to be a neuroscience textbook of some sort. The books that influenced me the most, whenever people say, what are the books that influenced me the most?
Yes.
There's 3. One is The Song of the Dodo by David Quammen. And this book does 2 things. So I believe, and I think this is a commonality among the best of the best. I mean, if you're really talking about the most exceptional peak performers I've encountered, they tend to have a number of things in common. One of them is that they are usually grounded in evolutionary theory and science. And the second is that they understand how to think at scale, and they understand systems thinking. And Song of the Dodo, which is a book about our current environmental crisis and the best overview of kind of the environment that anybody's ever written as far as I'm concerned, but it also is a phenomenal book at systems ecology and Darwinian thought. So I think it's a great book that way. There's a book called The User Illusion by a very famous European author, Tor Noritranders, that I think is probably the best book ever written on consciousness, and is brilliant and very humbling. I love that. And then the book that was the most influential in my life was a book called Bone Games by a man named Robert Schultes. And it's a book that looks at, he was the only person besides myself back in the sort of late 80s, early 90s. He was sort of half a generation before me in this sort of the same world. And it's a book about, he looked at the overlap between flow and extreme endurance sports like mountaineering and distance running, and sort of old Zen practices and certain American Indian shamanic practices. And so that's what that book looked at. And it's a very sort of scientific and poetic approach to the overlap between flow and mystical experiences, the really early work there. And so that book, I read that book right when I was starting my initial research into flow. And it was sort of confirmation of a lot of stuff that I already sort of had stumbled upon. And it was really important for me, because I was like, oh my God, I'm not crazy. This guy is looking at the same shit. He found the same things. And, he was a very well-established journalist, smart, worked at Rolling Stone, worked at Outside Magazine, was a war correspondent for some newspapers. Like, we trusted him. You know what I mean? He was a smart dude. He was a good thinker. And he was looking at the same. So, when you're looking at really cutting edge ideas, it's very, very useful if there are a couple other people out there with you who you can trust and are credible and have, strict truth filters and, are either reporters or scientists. And we're, those are the people I trust.
Which gadget you have that you cannot get rid of, or you have any favorite gadget?
Yeah, as I said, my favorite gadget are my skis. vocal mantras are my favorite gadget.
Okay. Who would you recommend me to interview next that you feel resonate with this podcast?
Well, if you haven't talked to Andrew Hessel, who's the world's leading synthetic biologist and runs the Human Genome Right Project in partnership with George Church out of Harvard, he's super interesting. Any of the guys I do research with, Dr. Andrew Huberman, super brilliant. One of the big Navy SEALs I do a lot of work with, Rich Divany, who's the guy in the opening chapter of Stealing Fire. He's known as Rich Davis in that chapter because he was still a Navy SEAL and we couldn't use his real name, but now he's out, so you call him by his real name. Those guys are awesome.
Thank you. And if you have a last question is, if you have to start all over and you can choose 3 things you can take now with you, which 3 things you will choose?
I don't know how to answer that question. I would take my love of books first and foremost, because I don't get to be anything. Like I would take my curiosity and my creativity and my love of books.
Okay,
that's what I would take with me.
Pretty clear.
That's right.
And last but not lastly, which?
And wait a minute, can I take anything from now back to then?
Yes.
Because the marijuana we're now growing in California, I'm taking that. If I got to go all the way back to the beginning, man, I'm taking some of the better weed. I'm just saying.
Okay, it works. And the last one is, what headline will you write for a book that is going to be read for millions of persons?
So, headline. I think so everything we've been talking about today, I've got a book coming out next January called The Art of Impossible, and it's a peak performance primer. It's everything I've learned for 30 years about peak performance, motivation, creativity, learning, flow in one book, as close to my editor says, she says it's the first time in history anybody's managed to write a big think how-to.
Wow.
So I don't know if that's true or not. I think Peter and I tried to do that in bold. I don't necessarily. I think bold is, people love bold, and I'm flattered and stunned and grateful. I don't think it's my best book because I don't think it's as how-to-ish as we could have made it. You know what I mean? I think we tried very hard to make it very useful, but I think we could have. I don't think we knew quite enough at that point. But I think this is a better version of. Totally different subject, but better version. So I don't know what the headline for that book is, but it's like that's the first book I've read where I'm like, yeah, you know what? If millions of people are going to choose to read one thing, it probably should be this one, because it's the blueprint. And if my thesis is right, which is peak performance is just biology working for us. And that's not just my thesis. It's a thesis that goes back to the kind of William James said it, right? 100 years ago, he said the most important thing in any education is to learn to make your nervous system your ally and not your enemy. So I don't think this is a new idea, but let's say that it's true. This is the thing that should be read by 1 million people, because we all share the same biology. Because the one thing I've written that I know is going to work for everybody.
Is there anything else you want to add, Steven?
I don't ever know what to say to this question. Go big. That's what I add. You know what? Here's my answer to that thing. Here's my like famous hard ass stance on life, which is, I've said this a couple of times, so I'll say it again here, which is, the truth of the matter is this: there are only a number of facts that we know for absolute sure. These are the things I can tell you are absolutely sure true in life. One is, we know for sure that we get one shot at this life. 2, we know for sure you're going to spend a third of it asleep. So the only thing I think is what you do with the remaining 2/3 is about the only question that matters.
And
Steven, where people can, where anyone who is listening to this podcast.
Yeah, StevenKotler.com, StevenKotler.com is me, and Flow, FLOW, Research Collective, all one word, .com is the Flow Research Collective. You can find me both of those places. And you can probably, if you want to talk to me, I'm Steven_Kotler on Twitter, and that tends to be the one place you can actually have a conversation with me, because I do sort of pay attention. Don't ask me why. I know Twitter's a dead medium, but scientists like it for having conversations with one another, so I happen to be on it.
I can say that that is truth, because I started talking to you years ago through Twitter, and then I just sent I upload a picture of the cover of the Rise of Superman, and you answer what you like the most, and yeah, it's true. So, Steven, thank you so much. Thank you so much for the time. Thank you so much for adding your genius here in this podcast, and also working towards creating a better humanity and better world for everybody.
Just trying to do my inch, but thank you.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Well, you had Steven Kotler on neuroscience, flow, the future is faster than you think, go big and live and do your best, be your best, and be disruptive, or the world will be disruptive with you, and this will be more painful. You've been in Disrupt Everything podcast series. Now go and make it happen, because you had at least, I guess, I know, at least one big idea from here that you can implement right now and take action, because it's what it matters. The journey continues. This is Disrupt Everything podcast series with Steven Kotler and Isra García.
Esto ha sido Disrupt Everything by Isra García. Encuentra el riesgo antes de que el riesgo te encuentre a ti.